Hey there, I'm Michael Demond, and I'm introducing the world to starbeam.one. This session is the identity system. Let's begin. Quick overview of the topics discussed in this session. Kind of getting into some philosophy here personally is that I'm not a fan of email, just in general. It's kind of a dated technology, and I guess it's all right, but I'm particularly not a fan of it with signing in and authenticating with a system because it can be used to be as a an indicator of value, right? It is something that can be used to sell. So it has value, right? If you compile a list of all these emails, that means that someone can spam you. So it goes on the dark web at a price, and that's what happens is that systems get hacked for their emails because that's where the value is at. So I try to stay away from them as a general rule because of that value. Same goes with passwords, right? If you store your password in a certain way and the attacker can figure out how that password is stored or saved or hashed or whatever, it can be used. If they can outright crack it, then they know your password. But they can take that hash, or in some way they can use that to cross-reference with another database, and then they kind of have a sense of who you are, and they'll try other systems with that same password, sort of thing. And it's just really there's a lot that can go wrong with that. So I just try to stay away from that. And what I gravitate to is Oauth, right? Oauth version 2. Really incredible technology, I feel, or a lot better than what we had. And so I just try to use it as much as possible. And that's what I'm using for starbeam.one is that you can sign in with almost a dozen Oauth providers that I provide, and it can do so many more, as we'll see. There's a site for ASP.net, and it's amazing. As long as you do, of course, the cool thing about that is that it's the provider. It's the provider that you trust and So I, as an application, have no knowledge of the password or your identity or your authentication. I know your identity from what is provided, but I have no control over how the security of how you sign in, right? So you sign in through this provider, and the provider gives me a token saying, hey, this is valid. This is a valid person. This is a valid identity within our system. And it's just a really amazing setup. So that's what I gravitate to. And it's also kind of going with this last point here is that it's who you trust, right? So you might not like Microsoft, but you might like Google, right? And that the opposite is true for me. I do like Google, but I trust Microsoft more. But you go with who you trust, right? And that's kind of a cool thing is that if you provide enough providers, you're eventually going to find one that you like, and that's who you can use, and that's who you can use to sign in with starbeam.one. So kind of rounding out the point there is that I do offer two-factor authentication, and so you can have two-factor authentication in addition to the two-factor authentication you should be using with your OAuth provider. So you should have two-factor with Google, and that's outside of my control, obviously, but you should have it established there, and you can also establish it with starbeam.one. So if somehow your OAuth gets compromised, if you didn't use two-factor is usually how that occurs, then you can also have a backup two-factor at starbeam.one. So the two layers of security there. Then finally, kind of another part of the identity here is that we have this proofing system that allows you to identify yourself with a system in a slightly anonymous way. And I hope to show how that works is that it's through hashing, but you can store email addresses and whatnot so that a creator, when they create their product to share their proceeds with you as a beneficiary, they can locate you with those hashes. So, we don't store the actual information like an email address. We don't store that email address. We store the hash to that email address, and then the creator would then search for an email, and then that leads to a hash, and then we search for that hash, sort of thing. So it's kind of a cool little proof, like, yes, this is me. If someone does a search for this email, it will result in this hash, and you can assign those proceeds to me. So it's kind of a cool thing that I hope to go into a little bit more detail here. Oauth 2, I could go on and on about this technology. It's a slide here, but I feel like I can just have an entire session dedicated to it. So I'll try to be brief. Starting out with this QR code, there's this site ASP.NET Contrib, and they have an exhaustive list of these providers. That's where most of my providers are from, and a great team over there. They're doing a great job, and I actually contributed to this repository last year with a mixed cloud provider. It did not work out, unfortunately, because of an issue I found with their identity. Hopefully in the future, but for now, it's almost a dozen providers that I use, and most of them are from this repository. So just great work out there, and keep up the good work. And that's sort of the baseline here with Oauth 2, is that you have these list of providers. I almost have a dozen of them, and you pick the one that you trust, right? So it's a relationship with a provider that you know and trust, and so you go with them. And I never know your email, password, username, any of that. You authenticate with them, and then they provide a token and identifier, which is usually a really large number, and that's all I know, and that's all I care about. And it's just a much preferred setup because it just offers so much protection. And the thing to kind of be aware of is that I have to do the same thing from starbeam.one's perspective. I have to register my application with these providers. So each and every one of these providers I go to, and I register with my domain name and terms of use, privacy policy, and all of that. So, so they know about me, I know about them, and it's a relationship, it's a partnership, is kind of how I look at it. Because now if another site comes along and says, yeah, we're starbeam.one with this domain starbeam.1000, just to give an example, right? And this is how you're going to do your business, and we're going to try to collect all this information from you, sort of thing. Well, we can go to that provider and say, hey, we can leverage that partnership and say, hey, these guys aren't the real deal. What's going on over here? Can you do something about it? And so that's what happens, right? And we can also further that relationship, that partnership with, fraudulent accounts and law enforcement, right? Because it's not stored with us, it's stored with this provider that you have to go through. And that there's so much benefit from having to use that. Hopefully you can see that. And sort of to kind of round out that point there is that, it offers from protection from phishing, right? So we don't store your email, right? You're not authenticating with us with that email. So they would have to get that email to begin with. So right there out of the gate, you get some protection. But let's just say that they get that email and they try to phish you. Well, what's that going to look like, right? You're going to click on this link, and you're not storing that email and password with us. So what is that going to look like, right? And you immediately are going to know something is wrong. And so it's just great. And kind of to round out that point is when you do authenticate with this provider, all it does, it's a prompt. So the sign-in experience with us is this prompt. Do you allow starbeam.one these permissions to access this data? And that's it, right? There is no email, no password, no username, and it's just a prompt to say yes or no. And on that note, we only ask for the bare minimum permissions. So we ask for like a display name. If you have that, and you do usually with this, with each and every provider, you got a display name, you have a profile picture, maybe a description if you have that, and then this really large number, this identifier, and that's it. So it's a bare minimum amount of permissions, the baseline, right? The lowest you can go. And another protection that offers is getting breached, right? So if someone were to breach our system or our database and get into our database, they wouldn't find much at all. And so there's just such so it's a very, very low value to do so in the first place. So very, a lot of benefit from having to do this, and hopefully you can see that. I think I mentioned this a little bit with bot protection, right? So if there, if you try to do an automated attack, which you see right now in the current NFT market space sort of thing, the marketplaces spaces, you're going to have to go through these providers, right? You're going to have to create that account, and most of them ask for a phone number. And so you're going to have to go through that, and good luck, right? So good luck trying to establish a bot attack through Microsoft, Google, Twitter, etc., because they are well aware of that and they know how to handle that. So immediate bot protection, and if they do get through, we can start establishing our own bot protection in addition to that. And one way of doing that is through these policies. So since all of this information is being stored over in these external providers, what we can do is start asking them, okay, how long has this account been around? And, how many followers do they have? So if you're going to sell a product, if you're going to try to manipulate the system, well, you can only create an account or to sell product in our marketplace if you've been around for X number of months and have Y number of followers, sort of thing, right? So that we know that you have a baseline legitimacy, and this is after the fact of getting through their systems, right? So just so much benefit from using this sort of setup, and I hope you can see that and appreciate it like I do. Types of identity. So in starbeam.one, we have two types of identity. We have public and personal. And with a public identity, you can use that to introduce and sell new product into the primary marketplace. And that is the only way you can do that. And the reason why is that we have this publicly verifiable identifier. And so these new licenses that are introduced under this identity are done so on a storefront that a collector can visit to purchase that license, but they can also see this publicly verifiable identifier and then click on it to open up a new web browser to verify that it is the identity that they think it is. So that's sort of how that's designed. That's the reason why only public identities can issue new product into the marketplace. And we have a list of them there: Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, DeviantArt, and Patreon. They all follow the same pattern there of having that root domain / username, and you can do that for each and every product that is sold on the marketplace with starbeam.one to verify the originating identity. So kind of rounding out the point here with personal, very basic, just a way to identify you with a system, and it is used just to basically purchase product, right? To be a collector, to purchase a new license or to resell licenses in the secondary marketplace. Identity backup. So this is a feature we're taking from ASP.NET Core, and it just allows you to link login. So when you first create an account with starbeam.one, that happens because you signed in with a primary identifier or a primary external identity provided by a Oauth provider like Twitter. It's kind of like my go-to example here. So you sign in with Twitter, and then that creates your starbeam.one account, and that Twitter account is associated, your Twitter identity is associated with your starbeam.one account. And so from there, you can sign in after you are now authenticated and logged into starbeam.one with that identity. You can also add another identity from another provider. So I go with Microsoft. This is kind of how I have an example for that. So you have Twitter is your primary, and then you've got the secondary backup, which would be Microsoft or Google, whoever you trust, right? That's kind of the idea here, is you're going with the provider that you trust, and that kind of going with that is that, each one of these providers do have policies. And what this protects against is, if you violate one of those policies, let's go back to Twitter, because this is where that would happen. You say something inflammatory, someone reports you, and now, congratulations, your account, your provider identity is suspended, right? And so now that's kind of a problem, because that may or may not, depending on the provider, may or may not impact your ability to sign in with the applications that are associated with that, in this case, starbeam.one. So you may or may not be able to sign into starbeam.one, and that's what this protects against, is that now you've got the secondary backup identity, just in case that you need to sign in still and have that access. So just be aware of that with Oauth too. That's just sort of something that can happen. And of course, something else you can do is go on your external provider account and have two accounts. You've got your professional account, which is the one that you would use to sign into starbeam.one. This is a non-confrontational, non-controversial branding account. And then you've got your personal account, right? And your personal account is the one that you're a little bit more free with and expressive as an artist. This is what you do. You kind of push boundaries, you push buttons, and you are free to do that with your personal account, and your professional account just stays where it is, and that is what you use to sign in with starbeam.one. So just kind of some ideas there to help mitigate these concerns, and something to be aware of. And then, finally kind of get into some configurations. If I am a creator, I would recommend having the required public identity to sign in with, and then also associate a personal identity as well, so you have those two. And then as a collector, you can probably get away with one, but you can go with two personal identities as well. I wouldn't go more than two. You can do more than two, but I wouldn't do that because also keep in mind that the more links that you add to this chain, the more risk there is, because if any one of those identities are compromised, then they can conceivably log into your starbeam.one with that compromised identity. And so we also have two-factor to mitigate that as well. So make sure you use that and be aware of that as well. Okay, finally here we're just talking a little bit about the proofing system. It has to do with identity, so we'll dive into it a little bit. It's kind of a nice segue before we get into the gratitude, because the gratitude uses this proofing system to identify beneficiaries. And so what this does is it allows you to specify a resource that you might own or that you do own. And so in the case of like an email, for instance, you can register an email, and then what we do is we take that email that you're registering and then send a code to that email. And if you enter in the code that we send you, then we say that you own that email. And so what that does is it allows a creator, when they create their product and they're assigning beneficiaries to share profits with, they can look for that email. And if you are in that system registered with that email, we're using hashes, by the way, not the actual email. We don't store the actual email in the system. Then you become that beneficiary. You become registered as a beneficiary for that product. So that's kind of how that works. And when you sign in with a identity provider such as Twitter, what we also do is we check to see the proofs that are available with that provider. So in the case of Twitter, it's a good one to use because it's public. We've got the identifier that is used with the system. So every account with Twitter has a really long number, so a really extensive number that's used as a GUID, universally unique ID sort of thing, or globally unique ID is sort of what it's called. It's just a really large number, and we save that as a proof every time that you sign in. And the other thing too is your username, right? So if your username is there, then we take that as well and assign it to your account as a proof. So that's sort of how that works. It's sort of a fun project to build as well. That wraps up the identity system. And security and identity is so difficult to get right, right? And you can see why a lot of systems out there struggle with it. I know I certainly do. And I'm not really bragging here or spiking the football, so to speak, that I found the perfect system. We may run into some problems, but what I do know is that we're not going to be running into the problems that other people are experiencing widespread, right? Especially with the NFT marketplaces these days. We're really looking to avoid that. And so, the other thing too is that we have Azure, right? We have Azure sending those daily, weekly reports about Cloud Defender sort of thing. So they have our back so that we can rely on that as well. And unabashedly centralized, right? And that's what this is all about. So, all right. So now let's move on to the gratitude system, which is a provable beneficiary system, which we'll learn about next. See you there.